All right, so we're in the last presentation. Hallelujah. These are so much better when done in person. There's just like no getting around that fact. And we will be grateful to see some of you in person, hopefully next year. Because some of this stuff just, especially having when you can do a site visit, like actually a field exercise to it, and go out and look at some invasive plants and see where some were treated. It's just so much better than just photos on a PowerPoint, you know. All right. So this last presentation today, it's something that is, I don't think it's a topic well addressed within invasive species management, and that's trying to integrate the management of invasive species with other land management activities and with biological conservation as a whole. And the sort of title slide here, I've kind of got like what, you know, especially like me, when I came out of college, I went to grad school, you know, moved back to Florida, my home state, and I'm working at a state forest. And it's like, okay, there's these invasive plant management projects. And I'm told I need to submit a project to the Uplands Working Group. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Like I was totally clueless, you know? And so like years later, you know, having much more knowledge of it, I still had questions about like, what's the best way to go about doing invasive plant management? You know, and let's look at two extreme scenarios here. On the left-hand side, there's this tree island just infested with old world climbing fern. You know, should you start there where it's the absolute worst and the most ecological damage? Or do you start something like here on the right, where you find the smallest incipient populations and you start with them? And I love the quote, go big or go home, or this quote by Confucius, the man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones, because clearly getting this tackled, there's a lot of small stones involved being moved there, you know, so just kind of like, what is a good way to approach this? All right. Here's a classic conundrum. I have few personnel. I got limited funds. I got limited herbicide. And even the FWC herbicide bank actually helps remedy that a lot. But just, I got limited time too, because of all the other job duties you got. So should I start with the largest populations of invasives first? Should I start with the smallest? Should I focus on management units in best condition, or should I work with those in the poorest condition first? Well, regardless of what you think you should decide with, everything that you do for invasive plant management has to be tempered by the other land management activities like prescribed burning, you know, any hydrologic restoration that's going on. There may be priorities in a land management plan that you have to abide, that's already established before you even got hired on. So take all that into account. So imagine this is a brand new, say, wildlife management area just bought by the state of Florida. And it was bought to protect some watersheds just off screen on the west-hand side here, or the left-hand side. But now you've inherited a hayfield that's got all these Kogan patches you can see from the air. Like, oh my Lord, where do you even start treating this Kogan problem like this, you know? All right, this is definitely a problem. Well, I want to focus on what sort of two theoretical papers have mentioned that examined sort of, you know, looking at invasive plant management. This first one is what I call sort of focus on the nascent foci, and it's published by Moody and Mack, and the full citation is down here at the bottom. Okay, and they kind of modeled what is the benefit of treating a single large population of invasive plant and ignoring numerous small populations versus the opposite of that, treating only the small populations and ignoring the single large population. And I don't mean ignoring indefinitely. I mean, you know, treating the big pop until it's dead, then treating the small, versus only treating small populations and not getting to the large pop until the small pops are all dead. Okay, that's kind of like what they're interested in. It wasn't really clear from their paper, like at what scale are they modeling this at, but to me, it seems implied that it's like within a single park or preserve, like, you know, it's not like a landscape scale modeling approach. So it's like just call it park level, like the level, getting rid of invasives within a park, And what's interesting is they had the assumption that smaller populations usually grow faster than larger populations in terms of just how much acreage is accrued, over time. But they did vary the rate of growth in their models, and that can be because some years are drought years, some years are wet years, some are hotter than others. But what they found is that if you treat more than 15% of the new populations in any one time interval, and you can think of this as like a physical year, state physical year, by just treating more than 50% of all new populations, you will prevent the increased acreage of invasive, meaning there will be no increase in net acreage of invasives in your park for, say, that particular species, whether it's old world climbing fern or Kogan grass, for a single species. And then also that if you could treat more than 30% of all new populations in each time interval, meaning like a state physical year, it would substantially reduce the time to eradicate the species from the park. And treating the large population first rarely ever yielded significant reductions in invasive plant acreage. That to me is a staggering finding, because what that means is if you have numerous small pops and just one big one, that if you could actually eradicate the large population, you couldn't do it in usually 1 year. It takes multiple treatments to do it. But by the time you actually eradicated that big population, the numerous small populations grew in size to the extent that they now all equal what your large population was. So you've actually had no net reduction in invasives. So that's a pretty substantial finding. And this is an info flyer from, I think, Department of Natural Resources in Wisconsin. And they're sort of showing how, I think, to the public, how resources in Wisconsin are being treated, to treat invasives, that there's this work on getting rid of the exterior small populations and work your way toward the big central populations. But another way to think of it is just treat the smaller ones first and treat the bigger ones last, And I won't read through all the stuff there, but let's sort of talk about sort of hypothetical model. So imagine this is a new small, say, county preserve, and the annual budget and staffing level allows for in-house treatment of about 120 acres of invasives. In this case, I'm sort of using Kogan or Caesar weed, which I think would be common in a park like this. I imagine this is like an old set of pastures and ag paddocks that's now collectively bundled into a single preserve. So I've got some invasive plant patches, and I've made this pretty simplistic. Like there's either 10-acre patches of invasives, a couple 60-acre patches, or one big 120-acre patch. Now, when I say it's 10, 60, and 120 acres, I don't mean that this is monocultures of it. I'm saying like this could be like 120 acres of Kogan diffused through pine flatwood, and it can have varying cover. But nevertheless, there's like 120 acres of Kogan, kind of like in one contiguous area with, a bunch of native species in it. Same for these mid and smaller patches. They're not necessarily applied 100% cover, but it's mixed in these different, what are you would perceive as different management zones now, because these were probably collectively owned by different ranchers or farmers. And so these properties, these units you see probably differ in quality and in prior, land use history. So I'm sort of going to color these in, and the colors, I'm not going to tell you what they stand for now. But just based on population size, based on that theoretical paper, it says, treat small ones first. So if we can treat 120 acres, well, how many is this? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or maybe that's 13. But anyway, you only have enough budget to treat the small ones anyway. So if you're especially if you're doing this in-house, just treat the small ones first. That's what you can do in a fiscal year, then go with that. That's theoretically what makes the most sense. But let's say, your supervisor says, I want to burn this unit here. Okay, well, previously you plan on treating some of these other patches out here. But if you're going to prescribe burn this, and if this is either Kogan or Caesar weed, that these two species respond positively to fire. You probably would not want this patch here to go untreated before a prescribed fire. So maybe that alters what you do need to treat. All right. So I can treat the small patches inside this unit. I can treat the 60-acre patch in full because it's inside this unit planned to be burned. And I can bite off some of this unit. And I'm the sort of patch overrides where these management zones or management units are meeting here. So I'm going to treat what falls inside this planned burn here. And I'm going to get a couple of these patches that are close to the management zone. Okay, so that's what my budget and staffing allows for. Or, you know, if your goal is just to prevent net increase in invasives, what you could do in theory is treat the outer perimeter of this so that you set this invasive back before the burn happens, and this core population can say respond positively after fire, but it probably can't recover anything more than what its original foothold was, and it allow you to treat some other small invasive patches near but outside your planned burn unit. Again, this is sort of like an artificially constrained system where I'm saying budget and time and staffing just says this is all you can do, period. You know, I'm not saying that's not true, that you couldn't sort of find more time and more resources to maybe treat some stuff. But my thinking is, let's say you planned on treating more, but you had 5 hurricanes come by, close things down, or, you know, there's a federal government shutdown that might impact the funding you get as a county employee that, you know, makes you not have stuff. So there's various reasons why you might not be able to achieve what you wanted to, you know. So it's artificially constraining to some extent, but it could be close to real life more than you realize. All right. And what if you don't have a prescribed fire plan in that unit on the west side, but you got a boss says, hey, we got money devoted for contractor funds to spend, and this unit's not in great shape. I want to vegetation mulch it so we can get a prescribed fire in it the following year. Okay, well, you got a small patch and this gigantic 120 acres of invasives here. Well, prudence would tell you still treat your small patches, and then when you have the mulcher on site, it can run through the small patch. But to be honest, under no real significant scenario could you ever imagine putting a mulcher through 120 acres of infestation. It's just not realistic. Mulch everything else, including this treated patch, but do not send a vegetation mulching machine through a large contiguous, you know, heavily infestation like that. Just, it needs to stay out, period. So you could do that as a possible option. Or at best, forget treating this patch way up here, eat away at the edge a little bit so that when the machine comes in here and mulches around this infestation, you know, it's going to back up into it a little bit. It's going to like dig into it by accident some, and that way you are simply reducing the capability of this invasive occurrence from enjoying that little bit of disturbance it receives on the edge. All right, so that's 2 possible scenarios just based on the advantage of treating smaller pops versus bigger pops with other land management activities. I want to talk about another theoretical paper that's a little bit more complicated. This paper modeling the effect on invasive species in maintaining plant diversity. And this was done in South Africa. And I don't mean just the country of South Africa, but the whole southern end of Africa, which has this really rich endemic flora called the fynbos. And so it's really modeled on the landscape scale. So it's looking at multiple, I don't want to say they purposely model as a bunch of interconnecting parks, but they just modeled a large area. But what they did in their funding was they altered funding levels for invasive plant treatment from year to year. That sounds like a real world scenario. They tracked the population age of a invasive. So in the previous paper, they used size. Here they said age, but these 2 are going to be highly correlated, most likely. And they also examined the cost of the treatment operation. And you can imagine this in a real world scenario too, like passing through doing a foliar treatment versus having to get like a brontosaurus machine in there and doing like removal of, say, like old growth melaleuca. You know, that it's just basically means like it's just a way to accommodate for complication or how complicated the invasive plant treatment was. And they also altered or varied the time it takes to eradicate the plants. Otherwise, some species, if all things are the same, some just you can get rid of easier than others. Like Kogan grass is going to take longer to eradicate, say relative to something like like a more simple herbaceous plant potentially, maybe like say the cerulean flax lily, that's in Highlands Hammock State Park, something like that. And then as these these things are manipulated, they want to assess how the untreated invasive plants at the end of each fiscal year, or each funding event, I should say, how it affected all plant species, the rare and threatened plant species, and the endemic species, which these actually can be quite common, but they don't occur anywhere else in the world. So invasive plants do threaten them in this respect. And what they found was prioritizing treatments where invasive plants were young, i.e. small population size, was most cost effective, meaning the most acres were treated for every dollar spent. All right, that sounds a lot like treating small populations from the previous study yielded more benefit. A delay in treatments both increased the cost of eradication and also increased the threats to biodiversity, meaning these endemic and threatened and rare plants, because if you have a reduction in funding levels, then the more complicated treatment, say like brontosaurus treatment of Melaleuca, may not happen. So there were definitely increases in threats to biodiversity because of that funding decrease. They also examined that if you treated the high biodiversity areas first, regardless if those have the young or the older populations, it only slightly increased the cost of the eradication of the species, but it did lead to substantial reduction in threat to biodiversity. All right. This third bullet point, that might not be relevant for a whole lot of us. Say like if you're managing, say some public conservation area that's say like old ag or old phosphate mines, maybe you don't have a whole biodiversity to worry about. But if you're like at the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park and you got a lot of those really rare epiphytic orchids, this might be really applicable to you. All right, so let's go back to our hypothetical scenario. So those colored polygons you saw now have meaning. We have high quality, moderate quality, and poor quality habitat. Sort of like the red light colors, green, yellow, and red here. Same budget and staffing constraints. All right. Well, based on what we know about biodiversity and sort of habitat quality, then maybe what we want to do is just completely don't worry about these two polygons over here. So even though treating small populations is advantageous, if you have some pretty high biodiversity in these units here, say like wet flatwoods with lots of flowering terrestrial orchids and lilies and stuff, maybe you want to focus on these invasive patches that are closest to the high quality units and just sort of ignore these for now. And that lets you even eat away at these bigger patches here, like make a couple passes through each of these two bigger units. Oh, here comes the real world scenario again. You've got both a planned prescribed fire here and vegetation mulching over here. All right. So what do we do? Okay. This is where we get to the point where you can't do everything with in-house staff. All right. You got to work with your in-house staffing or volunteers, and you got to start contracting things out. There's just no way around it. All right. So in this sort of scenario, what I recommend is you get a contractor come in and treat these three big patches, the two moderate size and the one large patch. Come in and have contractors treat that the first year before your planned fire, prescribed fire, and before your vegetation mulching. All right, so this is fiscal year 1. And notice that I don't even have interns doing anything in here. I mean, if they can, fine, but it's not even called for in this scenario. In your second year, have your in-house staff or volunteers go treat the small populations, but send your contractors back to these two units and this big unit here. Have them do the second pass on it because they're going to need additional treatments. All right. And now your planned prescribed fire and your vegetational mulching are planned for this year, right after treatments. Okay, guess what? Your prescribed fire happened. And that one prescribed fire now bumped up this habitat quality from moderate to good. It's in the same ecological condition as these surrounding units now. Also, that mulching, even though there's no fire on the ground, the mulching alone improved this habitat quality because I've got dense overgrowth out and it looks more in habitat quality like this unit now. At this point, you can probably have all your in-house staff handle the invasives because you're seeing this in this light blue. This is last year's footprint of the invasives, and you can see where you're making progress at shrinking these. All right, so send them in for fiscal year 3 to all these patches. And then maybe in fiscal year 4, you know, all they got is this patch left to treat. It was mulched 2 years ago and it was burned 1 year ago. So that's a hypothetical management scenario. All right, but again, all that stuff's tempered by what your agency says is a priority for the lands you're managing. It also has to account for wildfires. You know, obviously you can have this great plan and sequence of events to treat, but if a wildfire comes in there and does something and promotes invasives, that's got to change the plan you had in place. This is all with a grain of salt, but I'm hoping to show how these 2 theoretical papers focusing on young, small populations might sort of change the way you approach treating invasives in your own sort of project area. Okay, I'm going to end this show. I'm going to start recording.